Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And for all of us who live in Chicago and have lived here for a while, we know that this is a fascinating and bustling city. But many of us may not know the depth of history that Chicago carries with it. So our guest tonight is Professor Dominic Pacyga from Columbia College, professor of history, to talk to us about his book, The History of Chicago, a biography of Chicago.
Hi.
Professor Pacyga, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you've written the book, which actually I can see if we can get on camera. This is Chicago, a biography. Why did you decide to call it a biography instead of the history of the city?
Well, you know, Chicago's history is very complicated, and I've been criticized for leaving some things in and some things out. But I think what a biographer does is he looks at a person, he looks at the ups and the downs, and he tries to think about what are the main issues in that person's life or the main events. And that's what I did with Chicago. And, you know, talked about the things that I think made Chicago particularly unique.
Well, and it's an interesting conceit as well, because a biography implies a living, breathing entity that has grown up from, you know, an infant to an adult and has accomplished things. And so if we look at the city that way as well, it grew up from nothing. So was that part of the thinking as well?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I mean, in 1833, there's about 450 people here. 1837, about 4,500. By 1890, a million. By 1950, 3.6 million. And then you go into a decline. So, you know, like a human life, it goes up and it comes down, of course. Hopefully it won't go down all the way.
Right. So I'm fascinated by that tremendous growth in the early days. As you say, going from 450 people to well over 100,000 within a span of a couple of decades.
Sure.
I mean, I've read those parts of the book, so I know technically how it happened, but that seems remarkable. In the history of the world, that kind of urban growth seems unusual.
Well, it's actually today more and more usual. I mean, you've got Mexico City with 30 million people. You've got incredible growth of instant cities in China. But Chicago and maybe Manchester in England were almost instant cities. They grew up quickly. They were boom towns because of the Industrial Revolution. And Chicago really takes off with the coming of the canal in 1836 to 1848, the Illinois-Michigan Canal, which ties us into the Mississippi River, but which really allows us to be connected to New York City. And New York City is sort of the umbilical cord that we're connected to, the financial umbilical cord.
So how did the I&M Canal connect Chicago to New York, since the I&M goes technically the other direction?
Well, the natural flow of trade is in this country is north-south, through the Ohio, the Monongahela, the Missouri, into the Mississippi down to New Orleans. But it's very difficult then to get goods around New Orleans up to New York and over to England, because you have to go through the Saragossa Sea, the so-called Bermuda Triangle, and all the problems with that. And also it was a political problem of slavery. New York investors did not want to invest heavily in New Orleans because it might go away. The problem of slavery was getting worse and worse and worse, just as Chicago was emerging.
And
so
even then they knew that the secessionists were talking about leaving the Union.
Absolutely.
It may have become another country.
Sure. I mean, South Carolina threatens in 1833 with the Nullification Act. But in 1825, New York opens up the Erie Canal, which goes through the Mohawk Valley, which ties into the Great Lakes. In the far west and south that you can go on the Great Lakes with a good harbor is Chicago. We often today don't think of Chicago as a harbor, but in the 19th century it was 41 miles of protected harbor, and that is, of course, the Chicago River, which was one of the most important harbors in America. And really was a lifeline to New York City and to the East Coast. So immediately you start seeing money flowing from New York, from Boston, from Philadelphia, even from England, into places like Chicago, especially into Chicago. And once we take the railroad on in 1848, and you know, the first railroad chugs out to Oak Park. That's as far as it goes.
Right. But it was the first railroad.
Yeah, and within 3 years or so, we're the center of the railroad industry.
And I think it's hard for people now today to imagine, but going from what's today downtown Chicago to Oak Park, today you hop the L, there's 2 different CTA lines that take you out there in 30 minutes. But back then, Oak Park was a long way away.
Sure. Oak Park was a long way away. Hyde Park was a long way away. Evanston was a long way away. Chicagoans went to summer in Hyde Park.
Because it was far enough away
Far
from the
enough
city.
away from the city and the grime and the dirt and the noise. They went to summer in Lakeview. The Lakeview Hotel, about 3600 north, was far enough from the downtown. The river was really a barrier for the north side because the bridges weren't up. They used to swing into the middle of the river.
Right.
And so it was very hard to cross into the north side. So the north side developed last. The south side developed first. And the west side developed a little bit later. So these outlying places, think about this. In 1856, Charles Hull built a house. It was his country retreat. It was at the corner of Polk and Halsted Street. I mean, that's...
out in the country.
Out in the country, you're right. And later, of course, became Hull House.
Hull House, right.
Yeah.
So the transportation seems to have been the major hub, the harbor, the railroads, many decades later, a century later, the airports, which if we jump that far forward, when O'Hare was being built, again, way out in the outskirts of the city, it was, as I remember from my own youth, considered something, was it too big, was it too ambitious?
Yeah.
And it's turned out now that it's too small.
Sure.
Right?
The same thing with Midway Airport. And when you plan these things, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. The initial plans for the airports, the initial plans for the expressway system. Think about the expressways. If you're talking about transportation, here's a system that, my students think that the Dan Ryan always was, on the 8th day God created the Dan Ryan, Right. Well, the Dan Ryan opens in 1962, and it's supposed to be the biggest, busiest highway in the country, and it's literally overwhelmed within months by the traffic. And so, you make these plans, and then you realize how small they are, in some ways. But 8,000 families were moved for the highway systems in Chicago. Take the Kennedy, the Dan Ryan, the Eisenhower, the Stevenson, the Edens. 8,000 families. That's about 40,000, 45,000 people moved just so we could get out to Elmhurst faster.
Oh, which we can't now anyway.
Which we can't anyway. I was just on the Eisenhower, and you can't move, right?
Right. So, speaking of the big plans in Burnham, who famously said, make no little plans. But the Burnham plan, his plan, saw Chicago as expanding forever and becoming larger than some countries, Germany.
Right. Well, he predicted 20 million people in Chicago by the year 2000. He was wrong.
He was wrong. Yeah. But he tried to plan for 20 million people.
Sure.
Right. I think some of the other interesting things that struck me in the story, how urban planning seemed to be a part of the growth of Chicago, that the instant city created instant chaos.
Yes.
That needed to be dealt with in some way.
Right. Yeah, there was, I talk about an era of urban chaos where there's just, people are overwhelmed by the almost un-Americanness of a place like Chicago. And, you think about it. People are coming from small towns, people like George Pullman, people like Marshall Field, people like Jane Addams, people like Stanley Kobylsky down the block. They're coming from small towns in Europe, or they're coming from small towns in the Midwest or up in upstate New York. And they're suddenly in this teeming, dense, exploding city. On Halsted Street, they speak more than 20 languages on the west side. There's the L crashing over. There's peddlers in the street. There's 50,000 horses at the turn of the century. Add cable cars and trolley cars and, still horse-drawn streetcars. And then this newfangled thing called the automobile, and suddenly you've got, there's a great Yiddish word, mishigas, a mess, And that mess is really Chicago in many ways, and there's a chaos, and so you try to put order into chaos. And certainly Burnham is part of that. He doesn't quite succeed. I mean, his plans, if you've ever seen them, they look a lot like Paris.
Yeah, well, he was inspired by Paris.
Right, everybody loves Paris.
Yeah.
But even Burnham, though he might not admit it, was probably pretty much influenced by George Pullman. In the 1880s, almost 30 years before the Burnham plan, and George Pullman, of course, ran a sort of non-democratic kind of paternalistic society, and you could never really do that with Chicago. Chicago was too big, too unwieldy.
Well, speaking of Pullman and the Pullman Village, as you said, he ran a very non-democratic village, he owned his company owned all the property.
Right.
Their inspectors could go in at any time and walk into your house unannounced,
Sure.
tell you to fix something, or just start painting the walls and charge you for it later.
Right.
That seems radical now, but he was responding to something that he saw, this kind of chaos, right? And it seemed reasonable to him at the time.
Sure.
So I think one of the things that has struck me in reading through it is how people were wrestling with new issues. Now we take these issues for granted. We know about urban density, we know about urban crime. But back then, this was something new.
Right. This was something new. I mean, Chicago was the future. People would come here and go into the Loop or go to the Stockyard and just see this immense change. And was that going to be the future for Paris? Was that going to be the future for Springfield, Decatur, Mokina? What was the future like? And you came to Chicago to see the future. Certainly you did that in 1893 for the Columbian Exposition. But remember that at the turn of the century, 500,000 people a year were visiting the stockyards to see the future. And the future was the modern.
I mean, tourists.
Tourists, yeah, absolutely. Guided tours through the packing houses, through the cattle pens, the hog house, the sheep house. Because this was, think about what's more personal to us than food. You know, I mean,
food and shelter, that
yeah,
kind of sums it up.
Absolutely. We celebrate weddings and we mourn funerals. We have children and we have a party. We have birthdays. You know, food is basic to and everybody in the 19th century pretty much came from a rural background or were close enough to a rural background where they knew how to slaughter a hog. But it took a long time. It took an artist, a butcher who is in a way an artist, a butcher and his aide, 8 hours to slaughter a beef and dress it. It took 30 minutes in the stockyards from the time it got hit in the head with the sledgehammer till the time it was off to the cooler. So there was tremendous change. Yeah, and you have all these school groups going through. I mean, you know, one of the things that strikes you right away is why would anybody go see the hog kill? But it was intriguing to people in the 19th century to see this mass machine just putting out in one plant 8,000 hogs a day, 2,500 cattle, you know, 6,000 to 7,000 sheep a day being slaughtered in one plant, and there were many plants in Chicago. So Chicago saw itself as the fastest, the biggest, the most modern. You know, you come in here and people say, do you know how fast our elevators are in the Women's Temple? You know, they're fastest in the world. And you still get it, right? Oh, Dan Ryan is the meanest and worst and most, you know, biggest.
City of big shoulders,
yeah,
we're the toughest.
Right, that kind of stuff. The only thing we really can't brag about is Northside baseball, but don't get me started.
That's why I grew up as a lifelong Cubs fan. I'm familiar with the problem.
Okay.
So along with all of this rapid development, there was, of course, great turmoil as well. And
Sure.
Chicago was the scene of legendary battles between labor and management.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things, as I mentioned to you earlier, that struck me was I had no concept of how often labor lost those battles. But the strength was really on the side of management.
Sure.
Right? They owned the politicians, they owned the police, they owned the money. Describe what was going on there. What was some of the forces that were struggling with each other
Well,
there?
what workers are looking for is something I call countervailing power. If I push you and you don't push back, you'll fall down, right? But if you push back, then you come to some sort of countervailing system where you can negotiate. And that's what labor is looking for in the 19th century. Most labor. There are, of course, ultra-radical people too, but most labor is looking for some sort of countervailing power. Labor unions can provide that, so can political machines, a sense of community. The Irish parish model is very important, not only for the Irish, but for all Catholic ethnic groups, but also Lutheran and Hebrew groups as well. You have a strong institutional base. You feel secure in your neighborhood, then you can reach out to other people and create larger institutions. So that's what labor unions are. And in the 19th century, there were in all labor situations, there are three players. There's management, there's the labor union and workers, and then there is the government. And if you have the government on the side of management, which you often did in the 19th century, labor unions tend to lose.
Well, government controlled the force of power, police,
Sure.
the army,
Yeah.
which ultimately, and that's you see this repeated in that time period, where labor would have a strike and
Right.
the military would be called in.
Absolutely.
The police would be beefed up, the Pinkertons would be called
Mhm.
in, and through sheer force of arms, they would prevail and the strike would be broken.
Well, the 1877 railroad strike, 60 people are killed, all workers in the city of Chicago. The Battle of Halsted Street in the Pilsen community was especially tragic. 30 people were killed in one day. You don't get those kinds of events today. There are, more, how can I put it, sort of stopgap measures that prevent those kinds of things from happening. But out of that 1877 strike comes the 1886 Haymarket riot, where workers armed themselves with dynamite, and some policemen are killed. And out
Though
of
it's
that,
never clear who threw that bomb.
right, it's never known. I kind of think it was this fellow Rudolf Schnaubelt, but we really don't know. And then out of that, the 1894 railroad strike, with the Pullman strike, which is, and all the time
Again, ultimately broken.
by federal troops. Yeah.
But the long-term result of that somehow is that labor seems to prevail with certain basics like the 8-hour workday, a 5-day work week.
But that doesn't emerge until the 20th century. I mean, you don't
Right.
get the 8-hour workday really in steel until the 1930s, and you don't really get it in meatpacking until the early 1920s. And, and there's also, I think that the big turn for labor was the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt and the CIO. But if you look at labor today, there's fewer union members than there have been
in decades.
50 years. Yeah.
So, just quickly to diverge on the subject of labor, the power in the country seems to have shifted fairly significantly away from organized labor and more to the corporate ownership. In reading through the book, that seems to be it seems to be a cyclical dance, right? Where corporate power will be in the ascendancy for a while, labor will be in the ascendancy. Is that a reasonable lesson to draw, or do you think that has labor passed its peak? Could it recover?
For today? Well, part of the problem with labor today is that the economy has changed. There are no longer 50,000 steel workers in Chicago. There's no longer 40,000 packing house workers in Chicago. We're still a manufacturing center, but it's different. And those traditional labor unions, like what were at one point the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workmen or the United Steelworkers, those unions have lost their position and eroded. And I think now we're looking at a different economy, which is much more difficult to organize. It's much more difficult to organize, college-educated programmers than it is to organize packing house workers. I mean, in many ways you may think it's not because, well, you sit and you reason with people, but it's a much more individual kind of culture.
I've worked with programmers throughout my career.
Okay.
I'm familiar with the issues.
Sure.
And you're right, that is a very independent lot. The average programmer would not see him or herself as being a union member because they'd see no benefit in it. Well, what do I get from
Sure.
that? I just do my coding here and I really like what I do and I'm creating something beautiful, and so I'm going to do this, and if I need to work 12 hours in a day to get a project done, well, I take pride in that project. I'm going to do that because I want it to turn out right.
Well, because it's a much more professional attitude, which is a more bourgeois attitude or upper middle class attitude. I mean, organizing university professors is like trying to organize cats. They each go their own way anyway.
Yes, and so, well, actually, along those lines of whether things peak, you alluded earlier to the idea that Chicago had risen dramatically, had gone into decline for a while, and now seems to have stabilized. What were the forces that shifted? Why did that rapid growth come to a halt? Why didn't we reach 30 million people as Burnham had thought?
Well, I think what happened, it's a big country. And we'll take World War II, which World War II is really sort of the peak of population for the city. A lot of GIs went to San Diego.
Because they'd been at a base there and they thought...
And this is not a bad place in January.
It doesn't snow.
Yeah. Or they moved to Los Angeles, or they moved to the South. What's happened, of course, is with transportation changes is people are more mobile than ever before, able to move around. Chicago in the 19th century was a creation of a type of transportation technology, railroads and canals. After World War II, those railroads and canals began to give up the ghost to trucks and the interstate highway.
And air freight.
And air travel, right. Yeah, and air travel and air freight. Now, the railroads are still extremely important, and we are the largest container port in the United States.
Really?
Larger than Long Beach, larger than New Jersey, because they send all their stuff here, we put it on railroads, and we redirect it all through the country. So we're actually the third largest, I believe, container port in the world, outside of two ports in Asia. So, you know, transportation still plays an important role. But while the railroad's centralized, the truck has decentralized.
Because it's not tied to a railroad, it can
Exactly,
go anywhere.
Exactly. And as long as there's an interstate highway system, it can go anywhere, and it can go pretty quickly, and, you know, in a reasonable time. So, you know, instead of bringing all the cattle into Chicago and slaughtering it here and then sending out frozen or chilled beef, you can now send a truck off to Farmer Jones's house, pick up the cattle there, take it to a nearby slaughtering center in Iowa beef, and bring in, you know, cut meat into the Jewel or the Dominic's or Kroger, whatever, pretty easily. So I have a feeling my children think that God created chicken in plastic.
I have a coworker who had to teach her grandson that there was no such thing as a Doritos bush.
Well, there you go.
Couldn't take them off. So how do you see the city then evolving? I mean, city, as you say, this city grew up for a particular purpose. It was a transportation hub. But that kind of need has changed. So, and we've seen that in other cities in the United States. Detroit has lost half its population since its peak. So how do cities adapt to that? How might Chicago adapt?
Well, I mean, Chicago has a diverse enough economy. It's not Detroit. It's not based on basically one industry. When we lost meatpacking, we still had steel. We had Western Electric. We had telecommunications industry. We had all this other kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, if you think about the things that Chicago led the world in: candy production, meatpacking, steel, you know, railroading. All of that is still sort of there, you know, in some way or another. You know, few people know we still slaughter hogs in Chicago and calves and sheep down by the stockyard. There's Chipetti meat packing and Park packing. That's still our candy, just off the expressway here on Eisenhower. So it's still there, but the economy has changed, and the sort of digital revolution, I think, the internet and so forth, has changed the game quite a bit. We are a global city. We're not in the same first tier as New York or Paris or London or Tokyo, Hong Kong. But we are a second-tier global city. That is a global city that provides support for New York, Paris, London, Hong Kong. How do we do that? We do that by the legal profession. We do that by accountants. We do it through advertising, and we do it through distribution. We are still an important transportation nexus for the country.
Because people forget, even in the digital era, goods still have to move.
Yeah, you can't get this table to your house.
Right.
You know, and you can do it through trucking, and we're center of trucking. You can do it through trains, you know, do it through air, but you've got to get it to your house in order to enjoy it.
So do cities, especially with the technological revolution, do cities take on a new character? And the reason I think of that is that, you know, we talk about the wonders of digital technology. You can be anywhere, you can work from anywhere, and yet you still see clusters where people come together, Silicon Valley being the obvious example.
Right.
Even in New York, there are clusters of high tech where people need to be face to face.
Sure.
So, is the role of the city, although it changes, do you see it fading ever?
Yeah, density is very important. I mean, you just saw what happened at Google. I forget the CEO's name, but she said everybody has to come to work instead of working at home, right?
That's Yahoo.
Yahoo,
yes,
I'm sorry, Yahoo,
right.
not Google, Yahoo. Yeah. Okay, so, you know, you still need people to meet face-to-face and talk. As I tell my students, you know, cities are places where ideas get transferred, where they get intermingled with other ideas. You know, I may say, well, you know, I teach at an art school, so Maybe I have a way of doing a dance. You say, well, wow, that's really interesting. But maybe if you turned yourself a little more this, you need that kind of interaction between people, you know. And not only for art, but for ideas, for machinery, for everything. That's why universities tend to be located in cities. That's why think tanks tend to be located in cities, because you need the kind of urban concentration, the urban density, where ideas and interests can intermingle with each other.
In fact, there was a fascinating book from about a decade ago or so. Paul Ehrlich, his name is Paul, wrote a book about the ultimate resource. And he was responding to the doom and gloomers of the 70s who thought we were going to run out of oil and food and everything else. And he determined that the only thing that really mattered was the concentration of human intelligence, so brains. And that people, rather than overpopulating the planet, he felt that more population would always be a good thing, because more brain power would solve the problems that more population caused. So the cities kind of serve that purpose, to aggregate, aggregate brain power.
Think about it. People go to New York, not because the weather's great in New York. They go to New York because other people are in New York, and opportunities in New York, and people create opportunity for each other. And that's what Chicago was in the 19th century, and even into the 20th century, and can still be. R.R. Donnelly, which used to have the big plant on 22nd Street right off the lake, that plant is now being used as an internet center.
A high-tech,
a high-tech center, right, A merchandise mart, parts of the merchandise mart are playing that role now. People come together who, you know, there's sort of segregation by function. Jewelers Row, you know, people. We used to be Old Music Row at Jackson and Wabash. People come together with like interests to discuss and to have ideas and to create other things. And you know, there's this myth of the man sitting in the attic thinking the great thought. But if he doesn't tell his thought to somebody, if he doesn't intermingle with other people who are having great thoughts, then you don't get a Darwin, you don't get a Newton, you don't get a, you know, Copernicus.
And the lone guy in the attic just might be a little crazy.
Exactly, exactly. And you don't want him following you home.
Yeah, that's right. But speaking of aggregations of minds, Chicago has also played a great role in the university as a center of learning as well, right? Right. How does that continue to work in the city's favor?
You know, I mean, we have a great tradition here. The oldest university in Illinois is St. Xavier University on the south side.
My mother's alma mater.
Sisters of Mercy. And right through to Northwestern, and then the University of Chicago, and Loyola, and DePaul, and UIC, which was the first four-year public university in the city. Now we have several, you know. So it's, Chicago, there were 65,000 students in the Loop every day. It is the largest college town in Illinois.
That's a small town in itself.
Yeah, 65,000 students every day in the Loop. If you think about that, it's a little scary in some ways.
Well, depending on what the students are up to.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think they're not drinking and carousing during the day. At least it doesn't appear that way.
Okay.
Well, you're closer to it than I am, so you would actually know that, wouldn't you?
Right. Yeah. I would say it's very interesting, because what you've seen is, you know, the transformation of State Street, really from that great street, that retail street, which is now North Michigan Avenue, into a college strip.
Sure, there are a number of universities that are right there on State Street.
DePaul, Morris, Columbia's, Roosevelt, the Art Institute, they're all there, and all the stores. You're now getting Forever 21 and all these youth
catering to that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So with that, we're done. We're out of time.
All right.
Professor
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
You'll come back and talk to us again.
Be happy to.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. Please 19 at 8. Perspective.tv. Till next time, thank you and good night.